Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we are going to begin topic 8.4, and this is our second day on this actually. So looking at the spread of communism, and specifically we're looking at the People's Republic of China really during the Mao years. So from October of 1949 up until Mao's death in 1976. So, and we'll start with some skill practice today. So our learning objective today is explain the causes and consequences of China's adoption of communism. Okay. All right, so let's start with some skill practice. So if this were our prompt, analyze the relationship between Chinese peasants and the Chinese Communist Party between circa, approximately 1925 to circa approximately 1950. Right. So assume that is our prompt. And maybe think about a claim or two, or maybe just one, doesn't matter. But be thinking about a claim, right? How you would kind of be writing a response to that, with this document in mind, right? So Chinese Communist reports on Japanese military action in North China villages in 1942. So if you were presented with that as a prompt, right, and this is a document, how would you source this? Right? How would you source this? And maybe contextualization, document-specific contextualization, or historical situation, or maybe purpose or limitations. How would you source this? All right. So think about that. Pause that. Go ahead and write some of that down, and we'll go over a sample response. All right. So maybe something to the effect of, the documents written in the middle of World War II while Japan occupied large parts of China. And the Chinese Communist Party is trying to record the Japanese destruction for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Something to that extent, kind of situated into a larger things going on. Or maybe limitations. The Communist Party could be trying to inflate the numbers and exaggerate how dangerous the Japanese threat. The accuracy, I typed that wrong. The accuracy of these numbers, maybe say something about it. All right, and let's try the same for another document. So assuming that the prompt is the same, right? Analyze the relationship between Chinese peasants and the Chinese Communist Party between circa 25 and circa 50. Right, and here we have a different source: conversations between a teenage peasant and his grandfather from an area controlled by Chinese communists, recounted by Edgar Snow, a U.S. journalist, 1936. All right, so how would you source that? How would you source a document like that? All right, so go ahead and pause that and think about it, and I'll go over some answers. All right, so hope you had a minute to do that. So maybe some ways to do this, right? The document is written by an American journalist who is reporting on the revolution or the Civil War, right? That's going on. The American being allowed access to Chinese communist-controlled areas in China during a period of civil war. Nationalists, talking about Chiang Kai-shek nationalists versus Mao and the communists, and occupation. Keep in mind, occupation is going on. The Japanese will occupy Manchuria in 1931. Would have been closely watched. His access controlled. To make it to use an example from the Soviet Union. This could be a Potemkin village kind of situation. All right. Limitations. Right. This is essentially a man on the street interview. It probably reflects how many young people felt about Mao and communism. And as such, we have to question if it's being reported what is being reported is widespread or simply just a local phenomenon, right? So just because a person on this particular street or in this particular town believes this, is this a widespread belief? And and of course, how controlled was the access? Was this person allowed to speak to him? And is that why it was chosen? All can valid limitations. All right. So hope that was some good sourcing for you. All right. So here we go. So let's actually look at the Mao years, and so we looked at this in the last video, and just kind of start with this again. So this is right. So this is a quote that comes. Was it 81? I think maybe it was published in 82 in China. from Chen Yun. And I always like this because this is a Chinese source, right? So a few years after the death of Mao, 5, 6 years after the death of Mao, reflecting upon the legacy of Mao, right? So had Mao died in 56, his achievements would have been immortal. Had he died in 66, he would have been a great man, but flawed. But he died in 1976. Alas, what can one say? So your homework last night, this should make total sense to you now. Right, these different periods of Mao's leadership of the People's Republic of China. This quote should make complete sense to you. But we're going to go and do a little depth on this today. So we're going to begin with this kind of first phase, right? Let's start the Mao years. And of course, I'm not going to talk about this today, but keep in mind that before 1956 quote, keep in mind that as soon as a year or two into the People's Republic of China, they're going to go to war against the United States, and that is going to be a major success for them. They're going to bring the most powerful military on the planet to a draw. So for a young country, that is a noble accomplishment, or a notable, accomplishment. All right, so let's look at the legacy of Mao, right? And you'll often hear people say when they talk about what the legacy of Mao is, you'll often hear the phrase "it's complex," right? And so we're going to go through some of the we'll go through the specifics of Mao, the Mao years, and hopefully you can judge for yourself just how complex it is. All right, so let's start with some maybe positive, right? So what I'm going to say is going to be viewed as positive by some people. All right, so this comes out of the selected quotations of Mao Zedong, right, aka the Little Red Book. All right, so this is introductory note to women. Right, have gone to the labor front. Mao in the Little Red Book, of course, is Mao is a pretty prolific writer, and in the Little Red Book is just a collection, right, samples of his writing. So this is one that was put into the book, right? So this is something he had written in 55. In order to build a great socialist society, it is of the utmost importance to arouse the broad masses of women to join the productive activity. Men and women must receive equal pay for equal work in production. Genuine equality between the sexes can only be realized in the process of socialist transformation of society as a whole. All right, so generally speaking, especially in the West, in the United States, people will generally view movement towards gender equality as a positive thing. And this is not too dissimilar to what we'd seen, during that kind of golden age of Bolshevism in the Soviet Union, right? So not too dissimilar from that Trotsky selection that we had already looked at. All right, so when you look at gender equality and movements towards gender equality, many people will often kind of view this as a positive thing. And once again, this is simply a matter of perspective, right? So you could definitely make an argument that the marriage laws that get passed, I think it was 1950, do a lot towards creating more equal rights for women in China. Women are allowed to maintain ownership of their property, family property, once they go into marriage. Women are able to initiate divorce. You do see some unintended consequences of these policies, though. So there is kind of an unintended side to this. What else do we see? We also see a banning of the selling of women into marriage. We see a general prohibition on the arranging of marriages. We see making it illegal to commit infanticide. And just because something is illegal doesn't mean it won't continue. Obviously, infanticide will become an issue. Will maintain or be an issue in China for decades to come. Right. And when you start talking about this communal life thing, right? So this is something that Trotsky had talked about. This was in that passage that we read with Trotsky. Trotsky had talked about if you want to create true gender equality, then you need to break the shackles of the kitchen. And this is something that we don't really see, at least I'm not aware that we see on any scale at all in the Soviet Union. But we do see an attempt to apply this in China, right? So this notion of communal life, private cooking gets banned in the mid-1950s. Mess communal dining becomes the norm. Everything owned by the household is shared, right? It's communal. So we do actually see an attempt to this, right? Kind of an attempt to make this real. And when you kind of look at, if you want to truly make men and women equal, right? If you want true equality to exist, then there are two basic things, right? That would prevent true equality from coming to fruition. One is, this whole notion of food preparation, right? That is one thing that, based on traditional gender norms, that prevents women from achieving equality in the workplace. And the other thing is raising children, right? So if you are an advocate of true gender equality, then you need to destroy the family, right? You need to get rid of the family. And I mean, really, a family is, or the family structure is the center of individualism, right? And ultimately, if you're talking about what Mao is espousing here, right? He is espousing a complete breakdown of the individual, right? Let's eliminate the individual. The individual is the foundation of the John Locke-based society, right? We live in a Lockean society in the United States, right? A Lockean government is based on the protection of individual liberties. And what Mao is advocating is not that, right? This is that Jean-Jacques Rousseau application of the will of the masses. The will of the people being expressed, the commune, right? The communal, right? So if you want to get rid of the individual, then you need to get rid of the things that perpetuate the individual, and what is one of the things that makes people more loyal to something other than the community? The family, right? The family does. So you see, kind of very realistic attempts being made, so prevent women from having to raise their own children, right? So force them, to put their children into the state-run nurseries, prevent them from cooking at home, and then women will be freed from domesticity, and they will be able to work shoulder and shoulder with men in the factory, or shoulder and shoulder with men in the fields. Okay, all right. So depending upon what level of what you mean as far as equality of women, then you could view some of this as a success, or you may view this as maybe too much, right? It's all a matter of perspective. Okay. One thing that is definitely true, that we see both in the Soviet Union and in China, is you do see in the 1960s, especially, right? You see this in the 50s and 60s. We see much higher level of advanced degree attainment by women than we do in Western countries, Western Europe, United States, right? So we do see kind of much higher levels of women in the workforce in, what we would today call STEM fields, right? In the 50s and 60s, than what we do in Western countries. That'll obviously change, right? So, today in the United States, I know, or at least I believe, the statistics tell us that more women earn bachelor's degree than men do. So that has definitely changed, but we're talking about the 50s and 60s here. All right. So, all right. So let's get into the actual specifics of this kind of thing, right? So when Mao takes power, right, in 49, 50, we are seeing the kind of application of what eventually becomes Maoism, and it's still formative at this point, right? So, what is Maoism? And of course, we can kind of learn from these kind of early years, because once he establishes this idea, it'll be repeated over and over and over again, right? So what is Maoism, or Mao Zedong Thought, or Red Thought, right? But generally it's referred to as Mao Zedong Thought, right? So what does this mean, right? What does it mean? I guess there is a Marxist component to this, right? So one is this idea that the Qing era was dominated by intellectual experts, Confucian bureaucrats. Confucian bureaucrats is, this is that kind of feudal structure. And if you believe in a Marxian dialectic, if you remember that synthesis and antithesis back from the Marx video, and that the two will, come together in a revolution, right? And synthesis will occur. Right? If Confucian bureaucracy was truly the answer, if intellectualism was truly the answer, then why did the Qing dynasty fall behind Western countries? Why did the Qing dynasty collapse? Right? If intellectualism is truly the answer, right? So experts are not the answer according to Maoism. Common sense, right, is the answer. You should, if you ever want to know a true answer to something. Today, 2021, I guess you would put it out there to Twitter, right? And let the Twitterverse, answer your questions for you and do whatever the group does. Do whatever the masses tell you to do. You don't need to look at data or anything like that. All right. All right. So Mao Zedong thought, right? Class struggle must be maintained. And of course, since, we do not have a well-developed proletariat and bourgeoisie in China, we have our Confucian bureaucrat and intellectuals, and our peasants, all right? So we will see the adaptation of Marxism here by creating groups, right? So identity groups are going to be created here. So the original identity group created here in the late 40s and early 1950s is red, right? Which red is your working class, your peasants. In black, right? Black is your capitalists, your pretty small capitalist class at this point, but it's your intellectuals, the families of your Confucian bureaucrats, right? So this becomes a caste. And of course, this caste is genetic. So if your parent was a Confucian bureaucrat, or your grandparents were Confucian bureaucrats during the Qing era, then obviously, you, the grandson, is, you're going to be classified as black, right? So, and I did post a John Green video on the website that you're watching this on, and he does talk about the violence between these two different groups in 1950. And I think he case studies one specific city and talked about over 30,000 people being killed. Right. So we see this kind of grouping of individuals, right? This, that you can identify with, roaming the streets, finding groups of individuals within society that have historically wronged you or oppressed you, and violently taken it out on them. Okay. So this is kind of one component that we're going to see over and over and over again, during the Mao years, right? This whole Mao Zedong thought. What's going to simply happen is the grouping, right? Because we're trying to destroy the individual. The groups and group identification during this era will simply evolve, right? So once you have targeted the black, the capitalist, the Confucian bureaucrat groups, right? Once you've targeted them and they're either been killed or they've been sent off for rectification or re-education, right? Once you're done with them, then what? Right? Then maybe you still don't own property, or maybe you're not successful. Then you're going to see a new classification, a new identity group will be formed, and you can then blame other groups, right, for why you're not successful. And this process will cycle over and over and over again, as you'll see. All right. So we kind of get into actual policies, and right once we get by this kind of first wave, right, of communal or the communalization of society, or the groupings of society, we're going to see, right, a policy of stage collectivization, right? And we're going to do this in a couple of different phases, right? So the first phase is land to the tiller phase. We're going to see land distributed into the hands of the peasants, right? So basically, the group that did possess the land, their land was taken from them. It was redistributed, right? Redistributed, so it was divided amongst the peasants, right? So the land to the tiller, and a decent amount of land is going to go into the hands of a majority of the peasants by 1952, right? And it is generally considered, or this is generally viewed as something that was pretty popular in China, unless, of course, it was your land that was redistributed, then you're probably not going to like this. But, fear not, you're going to be re-educated, and assuming you survive, you're going to be re-educated, and you're going to learn the struggles of the peasant. All right. So even though you might not initially like it, you'll learn that that it is good, right? It is for the best. So this land to the tiller phase, I always like to make a comparison here to like the Lenin era NEP. All right. So after the years of chaos and disorder and occupation, this is land is going to be redistributed into the hands of more people, and they're largely going to be allowed to operate freely and make their own decisions. Right. Very similar to the NEP years, under Lenin. That's the Bukharin, NEP, New Economic program, right, during those Lenin years and the first couple of years of Stalin. Right, so we're going to see this, right, kind of play itself out, and this goes on into the mid-1950s. And you're going to have some individual farmers that are successful. You're going to have some that are not successful. You're going to see a lot of investment by the successful farmers, mechanization taking place, trying to scale their enterprises, very similar to what we saw happen, in the Soviet Union during this time frame. And then we're going to enter our kind of second phase of this time period, and this is the kind of consolidation into the larger units. So, under that first phase, you're going to get some mechanization occurring of the individuals. Well, this next phase is then going to, go and take those individual mechanization purchases and then put them into the hands of the group or the collective, right? So this is going to really start to take shape by about 1956. All right, so you're going to see the creation of these mutual aid teams. So all those tractors and harvesting machines and seed drills and everything else that had been purchased by these individuals, right, over the past couple of years, they're now going to be put into the hands of the mutual aid team, right, into the kind of collective group, and we're going to see them, the individual farmers who were successful, they're now going to be pulled off from their own land and forced to work other people's lands, right? So 92% of households were put into these mutual aid teams. Of course, you're going to see resistance to this, right? Just like you saw resistance, in the Soviet Union to this, right? And of course, resistance means you become the next group that gets targeted, right? So we see this in the Soviet Union, of course. Do you remember the name of the group that resisted Stalin's first 5-year plan, the collectivization 5-year plan? And who were sent off to the gulags, right? So hopefully you remember that they were called the kulaks, right? The kulaks. Right, so we're going to see resistance to this, right? But that resistance kind of gets overshadowed by other things, right? So when we talk about this transition, so this happens for the better part of about 2 years, and then by 58 they kind of implement stage 2. And this is part of that great leap forward, right? This is that whole agricultural productive cooperatives, right? So everything gets collectivized at this point. So any private ownership that had been part of the last few years is now taken away. Peasants will get a share of their profits. Whatever's left over after the quotas are taken from them. For the national goals. Quotas get established, right, for the collectives, and of course, party cadre, party leaders, right? They're the ones who set these quotas. And of course, one of the inherent problems with this system, right, and or that manifests itself, and I guess I'm purely talking about application experience here. One of the problems that we see during the Great Leap Forward is, the Great Leap Forward is kind of two ways here. It's collectivization, full collectivization happened at the same time as industrialization. So you're going to get two things going on. One is because of the industrialization, some of the farm workers, members of the mutual aid teams, they're going to be pulled off from the farms and forced to work in steel manufacturing and stuff like that. So part of the issue here is that you lose labor. The other part of the problem here is that these quotas are being set by party cadre, party bureaucrats. If you want to set yourself apart as a bureaucrat, right, you need to set high quotas, and you need to fulfill high quotas, right? You need to set it, you need to hit it, and right. So you have these individual bureaucrats, may or may not even be from the regions in which they are controlling. They're going to set these quotas, and they're going to meet these quotas, even if that meeting that quota results in the starvation of the population. And so this is kind of when we talk about this whole thing, part of the starvation event that occurs as part of the Great Leap Forward, part of the death event that happens is starvation as a result of fulfilling quotas. So grain is being sent off, right, to the cities. It's not because there isn't food, right? There isn't food there. The other part is resistance, right? So we don't really learn about the kulaks because the kulaks get overshadowed, right? So we'll talk about that in a second, right? So the Chinese equivalent of the kulaks get overshadowed, but we'll talk about that in a second, all right? I always kind of like to just take pause here and kind of zoom out and just, because we are talking about 5-year plans and collectivization and industrialization, because we're talking about Stalinization, right? We're talking about Mao's attempts to apply Stalinization to China. It's always kind of good to kind of zoom out and what was going on in Russia at this time. So as Mao is starting to push towards Stalinization, right, between 1956 and 1958, the Soviet Union is moving in the other direction, right? Khrushchev is now has the reins, and he is de-Stalinizing. And I personally, I always feel that Khrushchev gets a little shortchanged when it comes to historical legacies and stuff. When you kind of look at what Stalin was dealing with. Right. So Stalin, of course, he gives this famous speech, right? Famous speech. We have to consider seriously and analyze correctly the crimes of the Stalin era in order that we may preclude any possibility of a repetition in any form, right? Whatever of what took place during the life of Stalin. He is criticizing Stalin. He is denouncing the crimes of Stalin, the purges, the violence of the gulags. Even though they will be perpetuated on a much smaller level under him, he is criticizing them, right? So Khrushchev is criticizing him while Mao is trying to emulate him. And this is going to become one of the major sources of tension. Also, another major source of tension is some of the views of Mao. Very famously in 1957, Mao publishes The American Imperialism is a Paper Tiger, where he says, "We have a very large territory and a big population. Atomic bombs could not kill all of us. I'm not afraid of nuclear war. There are 2.7 billion people in the world. It doesn't matter if some are killed. China has a population of 600 million. Even if half of them are killed, there are still 300 million people left. I'm not afraid of anyone." Right? Mao is more than willing to sacrifice hundreds of millions of his own people if it means a war against the capitalist United States of America. And so you gotta understand, Khrushchev, the fact that Khrushchev, is kind of able to navigate, right, his the kind of the socialist world. His left-hand man was Mao, and this is the kind of political views of, or the kind of international diplomacy views of Mao. Also, look at Castro. Right, we know that Castro was furious when Khrushchev decides to pull the nuclear missiles out of Cuba, because we know Castro wanted Cuba to be destroyed. He wanted Cuba to be nuked. He wanted to become a martyr in the war that was started that eventually will bring down the United States. Right, so the fact that Khrushchev is able to kind of navigate, these kind of tumultuous years, and the fact that planet Earth made it to the 1960s, I think Khrushchev doesn't get enough credit for kind of navigating those waters. He was dealing with some interesting characters, right, on his side. All right, but anyway, let's kind of zoom back in here and get back to it. So the Great Leap Forward, right? So the Great Leap Forward, this whole movement from 58 to 61, transformed China, right, into a modern industrialized state. So what we've been talking about is the collectivization stage of it, parts of it, and there's also the industrialization part of it, right? So it's kind of like 2 5-year plans in one, right? So let's make it happen, and excuse me. So when you look at the Great Leap Forward, there is no shortage of like great videos out there. The BBC had pretty good access, so you can just kind of search online and find some pretty nice coverage, of the events of the Great Leap Forward, right? You can kind of see see what was going on. You can see the blast furnaces working. Yeah, so there's some great videos out there on that, and of course, one of the issues with these backyard furnaces, people were encouraged to bring whatever metal, instruments they had in their house left. Any steel tools, you're encouraged to bring it and then melt it down and then reform it. And of course, what happens when you kind of melt down perfectly well manufactured steel, and in a low temperature blast furnace, it creates something that's kind of the slang word for it is pig iron. You create brittle iron is what you make. So you take what was once a useful tool and you turn it into garbage. There's, in the Great Leap Forward is, it is an interesting time, right? So, so I would encourage you I know your story talks about it and you got some depth on that. So I'm just going to kind of move on to just kind of looking at some of the issues with it or the legacies of it. Very rarely, do you actually hear about individuals or about the, we hear about the kulaks, in the Soviet Union in the late 20s because they are resisting collectivization, and being sent off to the gulags. We don't really ever hear about the 2 to 3 million victims, of torture and death and whatnot during this time period. It doesn't really get talked about that much. So that resistance, right? Because in the Soviet case, this is largely what we kind of look at is the reaction or the crackdown against people protesting it. But in the case of the Great Leap Forward, we don't ever really talk about this kind of stuff. You don't talk about the boy who was buried alive by his father. His father was ordered to bury his own son alive because the boy was stealing a little bit of grain, and the father probably committed suicide a few days later. We don't talk about that kind of stuff because these individual stories and 2 to 3 million people being killed is a fraction of this story, right? The single greatest example of famine in history. When the lowball numbers are in the low 20 million people starved to death, and the highball numbers go into the 50s, right? The 50 million plus people starved to death. This you kind of lose. You kind of lose this kind of, the kind of reality of the individual stories, right? So, yeah, this is one of those things where, Mao will kind of push this policy in place. I'll share that video that I was just kind of watching because they do kind of talk about the fact that Mao's advisors, the people around Mao, were criticizing this policy, and Mao simply doubles down on it, and pushes it forward. So it's not like a 1-year, thing was tried and it failed and he changed course. It failed and he continued it, and it failed again and he continued with it. Right? He perpetuates this famine. Makes no attempt to try to stop it or what was going on. So anyway, the Great Leap Forward. Right, so we do see kind of at this time as well, campaigns to encourage people to, to kind of speak their mind, and people actually did. They actually criticized Mao, and so this movement is pretty quickly, ended, and it comes to an end, right? So there's not much criticism. All right, I'm going to jump to kind of the next major thing. And of course, in class, we watched the Vox video, the photo that triggered the Cultural Revolution. So I will just kind of show you what I'm looking at. So if you scroll down here, it's this video right here. So we watched this video in class just kind of as a quick little introduction to the Cultural Revolution. And right, so when you're talking about this next phase of time, right, so after Mao goes for a swim, I always kind of like this quote to kind of introduce what the Cultural Revolution is really about, right? So this is, one of Mao's officials being quoted in the New York Times in 1966. We want to enable our students to have the same steely revolutionary spirit that moved the men who fought in the struggle for the revolution, right? So today's kids don't understand what the revolution was about and what they were fighting for. That's kind of one way of looking at it. Or you could also look at it as people were beginning to criticize Mao. Mao believes that, the spirit of class struggle had been lost, and this needed to get, kind of reinforced. So you need to bring it back, right? This is Maoism, right? This is kind of Mao Zedong thought that, once one group has been targeted and eliminated, then you need to reshuffle the deck and reassign, your groups, right? And kind of keep this process going. So when you talk about the Cultural Revolution, the Red Guard, right, is kind of the next grouping, right? So now we have the Red Guard, right? This is our next identity group that gets formed, and then they will then, right, start to take to the streets and and to destroy the other groups, right, and anything that these groups represent, right? So the four olds, right? So the four olds, so customs, culture, like Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism, and right, destroy old habits, right, old traditions, and of course destroy old ideas or old ideologies, right? Anything Western, right, is included, right, in these things, right? So destroy the four olds, right, is the kind of mantle of this time period. Most historians, because it is a 10-year period of time, most historians break the Cultural Revolution into four separate phases. Phase one is from mid-1966, right, until 67. And this is the free mobilization of students and rebel groups, attacking intellectuals, teachers, professors, politicians who criticize the regime. So you make your groups, you find people to blame, why you are not successful. And of course, youth is a great place to do this, right? So you have your 20-somethings, your college students, your recent college students. You're dissatisfied with society, and so you find out who's to blame, right? Who is to blame for you not having that position you want, right? And target them. And this is simply a continuity of Mao Zedong thought, right? We saw this right out of the gates in Mao Zedong's China. And we're going to see this perpetuated over and over and over again, right? So we get these Red Guard factions, they take to the streets. There is a lot of death that takes place here. There's a lot of rectification, right? Re-education that takes place here. All right, so phase one moves, the kind of just the chaos and the violence in the streets. We'll run for the better part of half a year. And then you're going to start to see, this kind of spread out of the major cities, and you're going to see, to the countryside, where you get seizure of governments, and then armed factions kind of going at each other. You get hundreds of little mini civil wars happening all over China. And then this will run its course, kind of violence, right? Kind of violence in the streets, political violence. In the streets, and this is allowed to go on for months and months and months, and then fearing, right, that they may lose control, you're going to see the military then sent in, and right, it's time to put an end to this violence, right? So they will they'll suppress the insurgency with military force. They'll create new revolutionary committees, largely under military control. Martial law will be declared. It is during this time that you will see, a very serious attempt on Mao's life, right? So, Mao's life is, I think it was Lin Bao, right, who plotted to kill him. Anyway, the plot is uncovered, and Lin Bao will attempt to flee to Moscow, and his plane mysteriously goes down over the deserts of northwest China. I believe I read once that it mistakenly collided into a missile. Right, so this will bring us into phase 4, right? And phase 4 will be from 72 until Mao dies in September of 76. So, in the eventual arrest of the Gang of Four, right? So, Gang of Four, kind of most famously including Mao's wife. All right, so this is a period of restoration, right? Status quo, a period of disputes within the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party. You've got your Maoist radicals, right, kind of grouping up, and your veteran officials, your protest movements against the Maoist radicals. You have the seeds of a democracy movement, right, kind of festering within this time. And I guess that'll peak out in 89, right, at Tiananmen Square. Right, so and this is where, when Mao dies, the Cultural Revolution dies with him. All right, so why was it launched? Right, so you can say that you kind of have these kinds of realities of Mao. He was power hungry, he was a megalomaniac, he was vain. You can say those kinds of things, but I think I think I have to kind of agree with Professor Wilder here that Mao was an ideologue and he believed in Mao Zedong Thought, right? So what is the goal of creating identity groups to eliminate other groups within your society? What is the actual goal of that? And what is the goal of the perpetuation of that kind of policy? I think we saw the goal, right? I think this is what Maoism believed. This is what Mao Zedong Thought is. He's an ideologue, and he believed that this was how you moved history forward. This is how you enacted change. So I think at the end of the day, this was simply this is what he believed, and this is what he was trying to perpetuate. Okay, so yeah. All right, so anyway, there's a ton of images, right? So from this time frame. Buddhist statues defaced, right? It's right. So there's tons of great images here, from this era. One of the things you kind of notice, and feel free to kind of pause and kind of read through these things. One of the things that you'll see and notice, when you kind of look at a lot of this stuff, is you'll notice in their hands a lot of the time. That's that little red book. So this thing is published in this form, in the 1960s, and this becomes, I always kind of like to say that this is 1960s virtue signaling. So if you don't know what virtue signaling means, right? So how do you show outwardly? How do you show publicly that you believe in what you're supposed to believe in? You demonstrate to people that you shouldn't be the one who's targeted by displaying publicly, that you are also in support of these ideas. And the way I always kind of explain it in class is, if you have ever, because today there's social media, if you have ever felt compelled to post something or say something online, so that people don't think something bad about you. If you ever feel like you are pressured to say something, publicly, outwardly, so that people, don't come after you, right? So that they don't think that you might believe something, regardless of what you actually believe. If you feel compelled to do that outwardly, then that is virtue signaling, right? You're being compelled to outwardly show, yes, I believe in this. If you feel compelled to do such things, is that a good thing? Right? Is that a good thing? Is kind of an interesting question. All right. So anyway, more images. I'm just kind of scrolling through these. Feel free to do this. So here's Lin Bao right here on the right. So he is virtue signaling with his little red book. Before he plotted to kill Mao. All right. So there's that. Okay. Going for a swim. All right. Of course, if you watch that other video, you know the symbolism of swimming in the Yangtze. That's right. Destroy the four olds. Right? Destroy Confucianism. Ironically, Confucianism is back in China. Right. So maybe destroying Confucianism wasn't the best idea. And of course, we have Confucian centers all over the United States today. So Confucianism was not destroyed. It was resurrected from the ashes like a phoenix. All right. There we go. Tiananmen Square, 1976. There's some great documents out of here. There's also some pretty good videos out there. Because you got to remember, this is the era of television as well. So state television in China was making some gold when it comes to propaganda videos. All right. So some great songs. A little practice question there for you if you want to give that a shot. Actually, a couple practice questions. All right. All right. So, what is the legacy of the Cultural Revolution? Estimates 500,000 are killed, 8 million to 8 million, highball number. Is when it comes right down to it, is the number of dead really the biggest problem with it, or is it the kind of lack of education for years of children, mass relocations, and total turning China on its head intentionally? This is an intentional chaos. There are some pretty good little clips here as well. The Red Violin is a movie, right, that does kind of depict the Cultural Revolution, right, kind of the anti-Western aspects of the revolution. So maybe I'll kind of put some of those additional clips online. All right, so what is the legacy of Mao? Right, what is the legacy of Mao? Infant mortality, right, in 76, somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 to 55 per 1,000 babies born, right? For every 1,000, will die. So, kind of much on the later side. I think I have kind of a comparison, right, for you to kind of show you. Right, so 45. So I have that kind of written on. 45 per 1,000 live births, right? Do not survive in the first year. That's kind of how that should be worded, right? Right. So life expectancy by the end of Mao, by the end of the Mao years was 64, and on a later slide I have a comparison there for you. All right. So what do we see overall? Roughly a 2.9% GDP rate increase during this time, and we see an overinvestment in heavy industry. We see population double under Mao, right? So he definitely supported population growth, encouraged population growth. Economically, China is on par with Bangladesh, right? China is on par with Bangladesh. So when you look at the legacy of Mao, you can kind of look at, socially, culturally, right? Economically. So we can kind of look at some of those other thematic ways. If you want to look economically, China, historically the dominant economy on planet Earth, was in 1976 was at a GDP per capita equivalent of Bangladesh. I think during this time frame, I think Kissinger referred to Bangladesh as a bottomless basket, and that's where China was in 1976. The human cost, if you want to kind of look at, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, right? There's a massive human cost. Economically, if you want to kind of just look at specifically the Mao years, it is a period of economic stagnation. And you can see that there is periods of growth and then the Great Leap Forward, right? And then there's periods of stabilization and growth and the Cultural Revolution, right? We largely simply see, as military state at this point, we largely simply see stagnation and fractionalization of China. So we can see the Mao years, right? We can see the Mao years, and then we can see what happens after the Mao years, right? So the change takes place under Deng Xiaoping, and of course the dramatic change happens in 2001 when China is is allowed to enter the WTO, and that's when you kind of get that explosion, economic explosion, take place. All right, so this is it's kind of an interesting look here. So the Mao years, right? So is it complicated, right? Is it really complicated? You can formulate your own thoughts on that. All right. Students often like to kind of ask about the whole one-child thing, and so just so you know, one-child policy starts around 1979, 1980. It's kind of when you see one-child policy. Right, so when you look at China from 1949 up to 1981, when child goes into play, all right, infant mortality had declined from about 22 to 23% in 1949, down to about 5%, right, for every baby, 53 deaths out of every 1,000 live births within the first year. All right. I was kind of thinking what infant mortality rates are based off of. So yeah, this is a massive decline. But keep in mind, all right, China in 1949 with 227 babies die per 1,000 live births in that first year. I mean, China is coming off from a 4-year civil war as well as 8 years of Japanese occupation. Right, so it's pretty chaotic. So keep in mind that when you start looking at these 48, 49 numbers, life expectancy of 35, Civil War, Japanese occupation, right? That's what it's coming out of, or that's what's going on during that time, right? So life expectancy goes from 35 to 66, right? So this is why we see a population explosion, right? So infant mortality rate largely goes down, even with tens of millions of starving to death, even with millions being killed in the Great Leap Forward and in the Cultural Revolution, even with the chaos, because we see an overall drop in infant mortality rates, because we see a dramatic increase in life expectancy, we're going to see the population explode in China. During the lifetime of Mao, you do see towards the end of the Mao years, some attempts to deal with population growth, right? So 1970, pushing back, marriage years, marriage dates, as well as some people, some groups being asked to only have 2 children, right? But when you look at the one-child policy, which we're not going to get into that, at all, really, at least not in this unit. When it comes to one child, there are a ton of unintended consequences associated with one-child policy, from infanticide to use of sonograms to target abortions. Reality is you get a demographic crisis, by the early 2000s, where you have a lopsided population, where you have more males than females in your society. So there's over, for every 100 women in China, there's over 120 men, right? So you have an imbalanced population, and you also have this kind of, this age surge here as well. When you get this 4-2-1 kind of demographic, you've got a small number of young right? Working taxpayers, however you want to call them, supporting a growing population. So, there's a whole bunch of demographic issues associated with one child. You will see a movement away from that during the 2000 teens, right? So anyway, but yeah, maybe we'll look at that in the future unit. All right, so let's kind of end off back with our original quote, right? So, and hopefully this makes more sense to you now. So had Mao died in 56, his achievements would have been immortal. Keep in mind, remember the Korean War thing as well, right? Had he died in 66, he would have still been a great man, but flawed. But he died in 76. Alas, what can one say? All right, so this is just kind of looking at, right, just remember, we periodized the Mao years, Great Leap Forward, and then the Cultural Revolution years. Let's just kind of summarize what I've already said. All right, that is all for today. Sapriati.